My family tried to evict me. The judge's ruling left them shaking and I never imagined that the people I had loved, supported, and protected my entire life could turn their faces toward me with such coldness, as though I were nothing more than a stranger wandering into a house that no longer recognized me. My name is David Thompson, and I am 53 years old. For more than 3 decades, I dedicated myself entirely to my family, working long hours, sacrificing my comfort, and never once complaining because I believed that love was enough to bind us together. I poured everything I had into making our home a place of safety and warmth, every brick, every wall, every corner infused with my care and sweat. I thought that my devotion would be returned with respect and gratitude. I was wrong. It all started on an ordinary afternoon. The kind that seems like any other, with sunlight streaming through the windows, the familiar smell of coffee lingering in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, and the gentle tick of the wall clock. I was sitting in my favorite chair, a cup of coffee in hand, thinking about the errands I needed to run that day, when I heard voices that immediately made my stomach sink. They weren't ordinary voices. They were sharp, tense, and full of accusation. My children and my wife, or at least the people I had always believed were my family, were standing there in the hallway, but it wasn't their usual laughter or chatter that greeted me. There was no warmth, no recognition of the years I had spent keeping this household together. Instead, I felt a chill as I looked at their faces, a sense of betrayal creeping over me in a way I could never have anticipated. They spoke quickly, as if reading from a script they had rehearsed for months. They told me I had no right to be in my own home. I could feel my hands start to tremble slightly as I tried to process their words. How could they say such a thing? How could the people I had spent decades caring for suddenly claim that I was the intruder? I had built this house, paid the mortgage, fixed every leak, every broken door, every squeaky floorboard, and every flickering light. I had been the one awake during nights when illness or fear kept them up, making sure everything was safe and cared for. And now, with a few cruel words, they treated me as if I were the problem, as if my presence was a burden they could no longer tolerate. Their plan was clear, though they pretended it was reasonable. They said that I had to leave immediately, that if I did not vacate the house voluntarily, they would take me to court and force me out. I felt a storm of emotions inside me, each one hitting harder than the last. There was shock, disbelief, and a deep sense of sadness at the realization that the people I had trusted the most had plotted. Looking back now, it almost feels unreal how blind I had been through all those years, because I truly believed that love, loyalty, and hard work would always be enough to keep a family together, and to make them appreciate the person who stood by them through every storm. For decades, I woke up before the sun and worked until late in the evening, taking on whatever jobs I could find, and sometimes even running from one shift straight into another, so that my wife and children never had to feel the weight of the world on their shoulders. I pushed my own dreams aside and poured my energy into building a life that I hoped would give them comfort, safety, and opportunity. I believed that if I carried the heavy load, they would at least see it and value it. But I understand now that I had been giving and giving without ever noticing that they were quietly taking without a second thought. I remember nights when I came home sore and exhausted, every muscle burned with fatigue. Yet I still made sure the bills were paid and the house repairs were done because I did not want them to worry. I fixed broken steps, replaced leaking pipes, painted walls, and even stayed up the whole night checking on my children when they were sick. I never complained because I thought that is what a husband and father is supposed to do. I thought they saw my effort, but it turned out they saw it as nothing more than a duty and not an act of love. Even when they made mistakes, I was the one who stepped in to shield them. My son once wrecked the car, and instead of scolding him, I spent the entire night quietly working on the damaged parts so he would not get in trouble with the insurance. My daughter overspent on her college expenses, and I took another shift to cover her fees without making her feel guilty. My wife made decisions that cost us thousands, And I took the loss with a steady breath, because I believed that supporting your partner meant standing by them, even when things went wrong. I thought these moments would someday be remembered with gratitude, but now I know they were barely even noticed. Those sacrifices were invisible to them, because they had grown used to the idea that I would always fix things, that I would always provide, and that I would always be the one who stepped up when everything else fell apart. For years their behavior seemed normal to me, because I told myself that family always has ups and downs, and I accepted every cold word and careless action as just temporary stress or frustration. But little signs began to appear, small hints that something was shifting under the surface. My wife started speaking to me with an impatient tone, as if she were tired of my presence, instead of appreciating the partnership we once shared. My children slowly stopped involving me in their lives, and when they did speak to me, it always revolved around what they needed, or what they wanted, instead of how I was doing, or what I might be feeling. They began to treat me as if the house was theirs, and I was just someone who happened to live there, which felt strange, but I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just another phase. Then the comments started to become sharper and colder. One of them would say things like, "You do not really need this place anymore," or "You could live somewhere smaller," or "Why are you always doing things your own way?" At first, I did not pay much attention to these comments because I was busy working and trying to keep the household running, but slowly I began to sense that these were not random thoughts. They were testing the ground, seeing how I reacted, and whether I noticed the shift in their tone. I should have seen the warning signs earlier, but love has a way of clouding your judgment, and loyalty blinds you to betrayal even when it is happening right in front of you. One evening, I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. They were discussing selling the house as if it were some old piece of furniture they no longer needed. They spoke about listing it for a high price and splitting the money as if I did not exist, as if my years of sacrifice never mattered, as if I had not poured every ounce of energy into this home. My heart dropped when I realized they were not just talking about the future. They had already looked into real estate agents and market values. They had already made plans. They were simply waiting for the right moment to push me aside and take control. I stood in the hallway listening to their voices echo through the air, and I felt something inside me break. They had forgotten everything I had done, or maybe they had never appreciated it in the first place. They were planning to erase me from my own life. The truth hit me fully a week later when I found documents on the dining table carelessly left out, as if fate wanted me to finally see the reality. Papers that showed they had been meeting with a lawyer without telling me. Papers that detailed how they planned to argue that I had no claim to the house. Papers that outlined how they could force me out if I refused to leave voluntarily. It was a plan they had crafted behind my back for months and maybe even years. A plan built on lies and manipulation. A plan that betrayed every ounce of trust I had given them. I stood there staring at those documents, feeling a deep ache in my chest, not just because they wanted the house, but because they had done this without hesitation, without guilt, without a single moment of considering how this would destroy me. They wanted the money from the house. They wanted to cash in on the one thing I had built through decades of sweat and sacrifice. They believed they could remove me quietly, as if I were nothing more than an old piece of clutter they wanted to clear out, so they could make room for their own ambitions. They thought I was too old to fight. They thought I was too naive to understand what they were doing. They thought that my kindness, my patience, and my quiet nature meant I would simply accept their decision and walk away from everything I had worked for. They saw my gentleness as weakness and my love as stupidity. It is almost amusing now how wrong they were, because the moment they underestimated me, the moment they assumed I was powerless, that was the moment their entire plan began to fall apart. Their arrogance blinded them, and they believed they could continue plotting without consequences. They never imagined I would discover the truth. They never imagined I had enough strength left in me to stand up for myself. They never imagined that the man they thought was too soft, too old, and too tired would be the very man who would expose them and fight them with more determination than they had ever seen. And as I stood there absorbing the weight of everything they had hidden from me, the years of sacrifice, the silent nights, the unspoken loyalty, and the endless support, all rushed through my mind. I realized that this betrayal was not born overnight. It had been growing slowly like a shadow stretching itself across the walls of my home, darkening the light I had worked so hard to keep alive. And it hit me hard that every moment I had spent taking care of them had been treated as nothing. They saw me not as the foundation of the family, but as an obstacle standing in the way of their greed. And that simple realization changed everything inside me. It woke something up, something strong and unshakable, something they never expected. It was the beginning of the transformation that would eventually turn their entire plan to dust. The confrontation that day became a moment carved into my memory in a way I wish it had not, because it felt like the world I had built for decades was being torn apart in front of my eyes, and yet I was expected to sit there and pretend everything was normal. They gathered in the kitchen with the kind of forced politeness that carries the weight of something ugly hiding beneath the surface. The kitchen had always been the heart of our home, filled with laughter, shared meals, and quiet conversations. Yet on that day, it felt like a courtroom with no fairness and no mercy. I walked into the room expecting a simple conversation, thinking perhaps they wanted to discuss something troubling or something that needed my guidance. But the moment I sat down, I felt the air tighten around me like a rope being pulled from every side. Their eyes avoided mine at first, which should have been the first sign that something was terribly wrong. But before I could speak, they launched their attack all at once, as if they had rehearsed the moment for weeks. They accused me of neglecting them financially, even though every bill, every need, every crisis had been supported by the work of my own tired hands. They claimed I had no right to the home that I spent more than half my life working for and protecting. They twisted memories and reshaped history to suit the narrative they wanted to build. And they acted as though I had been the selfish one, even though my entire life had been a chain of sacrifices made quietly and willingly for them. I sat there absorbing their words, feeling each one strike me deeper than the last, because it was not just a disagreement or a misunderstanding. It was a full assault on my character, my integrity, and the years of love I had poured into the people standing before me. They spoke over each other, trying to overpower the truth with noise and accusations. Yet every sound they made felt strangely distant, like the ringing in your ears after a loud explosion, when everything becomes muffled and surreal. I tried to keep my voice steady when I finally managed to speak, but inside I felt something shaking, a mix of disbelief and anger rising in a way I had never felt before. It was not the anger of a man who had been inconvenienced. It was the anger of a man who suddenly realized that the people he trusted the most had taken advantage of his kindness and were now attempting to erase everything he had done for them. Their audacity left me stunned. I looked at each of them and wondered how long this resentment had been growing inside them, how long they had been rewriting the story of our lives to make me the villain, how long they had been preparing to cast me aside like a forgotten piece of furniture. They accused me of selfishness, which almost made me laugh if it had not hurt so deeply, because selfish was the last thing I had ever been. I was the one who stayed up nights worrying about their futures while they slept peacefully. I was the one who worked endlessly to make sure they had a home filled with warmth and stability. I was the one who made every sacrifice, yet they stood there acting like I had done nothing for them. As they continued to speak, I felt something shift inside me. It was the moment I realized that the man I had been for most of my life, the quiet man who bit his tongue to keep the peace, the patient man who forgave without question, the man who carried burdens so others would never have to feel their weight, that man was fading. In his place stood someone who finally saw the truth with painful clarity. I understood then that silent endurance was no longer an option. Their behavior had crossed a line that could never be washed away with apologies or excuses. They had taken my loyalty and twisted it into a weapon. They had taken my love and turned it into a weakness they believed they could exploit. My anger rose slowly, not wild or chaotic, but steady and controlled, like a fire that had finally found the oxygen it had been denied for too long. I knew that any reaction born from rage alone would only feed their claims, so I forced myself to breathe deeply and let the fire settle into something sharper, something stronger, something they would never expect. I reminded myself that I was not powerless. I reminded myself that I had the truth and I had the law on my side. I reminded myself that they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated me. They thought that because I had always been gentle, patient, and quiet that I would simply accept their lies and back down. They believed that fear would make me retreat, but the only thing their words awakened in me was determination. A deep, steady, unwavering determination to stand my ground. I looked at each of them, and for the first time in my life, I saw them not as my family, but as people who had chosen greed over loyalty and deception over love. And that realization hurt more than anything they had said, because it meant the life I had known, the family I thought I had, the bonds I believed were unbreakable, were nothing more than illusions that had dissolved the moment they realized they had something to gain by tearing me down. Yet even with that pain burning through me, I felt a new strength forming inside me. A strength built on truth, on justice, and on the quiet power of a man who has finally had enough. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, and clear. I told them that I had heard enough. I told them that every accusation they had made was false, and that I would not allow lies to dictate my life. I told them that if they wanted to challenge me, then we would do it through the one place where truth could not be twisted by manipulation: the courtroom. And as I said those words, I saw a flicker of doubt cross their faces, because in that moment they realized I was not afraid. I would not be bullied. I would not be silenced. In that confrontation, I became someone new, someone stronger, someone who understood that love without respect has no foundation, someone who understood that silence in the face of betrayal only empowers the betrayer, someone who understood that standing up for yourself is not selfish but necessary. And as I stood from that kitchen table, I felt something inside me settle like a stone planting itself firmly into the ground. I knew then that the battle ahead would not be easy, but I also knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not lose, because I had truth on my side. I had the law on my side, and for the first time in a long time I had myself on my side. I had always believed that betrayal was something that happened to other people, strangers in news stories, characters in books, faces on television screens. I never imagined it would come from within my own walls, from the people whose laughter had once filled these rooms, whose footsteps had echoed through the hallways as children. But as the days unfolded, the truth revealed itself piece by piece, not like a sudden explosion but like a slow, suffocating fog seeping into every corner of my life. Every discovery chipped away at the illusion I had lived under for years, and what remained was a portrait of people I barely recognized. Their smiles had been masks, their concern an act, their kindness nothing more than a rehearsed performance meant to keep me blind, while they quietly replaced every piece of my life with something twisted and calculated. It began with small things, things anyone else might have ignored. My daughter whispering on the phone and pausing when I entered the room. My son visiting more often but never staying long enough to truly talk. My wife avoiding eye contact whenever the subject of the house came up, brushing it aside with an uncomfortable laugh. At first, I brushed it off. Families go through phases, I told myself. People get busy, they get stressed, they get distracted. But the more these patterns repeated, the more uneasy I began to feel. It was like watching a play where the actors kept forgetting their lines, revealing pieces of a script they were trying desperately to hide. One afternoon, when the house was quiet and sunlight spilled across the dining table, I noticed an envelope sticking out from behind a stack of magazines. It was addressed not to me but to my wife from a local law firm. Something inside me tightened. A normal letter, I thought. Probably nothing. But another part of me, the part that had started noticing the strange silences and the unfinished sentences, urged me to open it. My hands trembled as I carefully unfolded the papers inside, and the moment my eyes read the first line, I felt my heart drop like a stone into cold water. It was a draft document outlining the transfer of property, my home, the place I had built with sweat and sacrifice, to my children. Not signed, not finalized, but prepared, ready, waiting for the right moment. For a few seconds my mind went blank. The room around me blurred. My own heartbeat sounded painfully loud, as if it were echoing through an empty hall. I sat down slowly, the letter still in my hand, feeling the weight of something heavy sinking deep inside my chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intentional. But the letter was only the beginning. Once suspicion settles into your bones, it changes the way you see everything. It sharpens your senses, makes you notice the details you once ignored. And so I began looking, quietly, carefully, as if I were navigating a minefield that had been hidden beneath the carpet of my own home. My eyes fell on every drawer, every cabinet, every folder I had once assumed was harmless. And slowly, the truth emerged like a monster crawling out of the dark. I found more documents, emails printed and hidden away, bank statements showing deposits that didn't make sense, meetings scheduled under innocent names but tied to legal advisors and real estate agents. And worst of all, I found messages between my wife and my children, words so cold and calculated that I had to read them multiple times just to accept they were real. They spoke about me not as a husband or a father, but as an obstacle. A problem they needed to clear, a burden they needed to manage, a man whose life they were planning to uproot for their own gain. They discussed how to convince me to leave willingly, how to manipulate me, how to corner me emotionally and legally. They even had a timeline, a carefully planned sequence of steps they believed would end with me quietly handing over the house they felt entitled to. Every sentence sliced deeper than the last. Every word felt like a betrayal wrapped in ink. And yet it wasn't just the documents that hurt me. It was the realization that they had been living two lives, one in front of me, where they pretended to care, and one behind my back, where they schemed and plotted as if I were nothing more than a name on a deed they desperately wanted erased. The way my daughter smiled when she visited, the way my son hugged me before leaving, the way my wife asked if I needed anything, all of it felt suddenly fake, rehearsed, hollow. I replayed those moments again and again in my mind, searching for signs I had missed, wondering how long they had been planning this. Months, years, maybe even longer. I felt sick, physically sick, knowing that while I had been fixing leaking pipes, repairing the fence, paying the bills, and doing everything I could to keep the home standing, they had been working in the shadows to take it away from me. While I lay awake worrying about their futures, they were busy redesigning mine without my knowledge. While I trusted them blindly, they were building a trap beneath my feet. But betrayal has a way of transforming people. It can break you, or it can awaken something in you. And in that dark, painful moment, something inside me shifted. The man who spent years swallowing his hurt for the sake of family was gone. The man who forgave too easily, who overlooked too much, who believed love was enough to protect him. That man had been quietly buried by their actions. In his place stood someone new, someone sharper, someone quieter. Someone who felt anger not like fire but like ice, controlled, cold, and unshakable. I spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling while the pieces of their betrayal assembled themselves in my mind like a grotesque puzzle. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Because confrontation without preparation is nothing but noise, and I refused to walk blindly into the trap they had set for me. If they thought I would simply step aside, they were wrong. If they believed my love for them would stop me from defending myself, they had underestimated me more than they realized. Betrayal had given me clarity, and that clarity became my greatest weapon. I continued to observe them during the following days. They behaved as if nothing unusual was happening, but now that I knew the truth, every gesture, every glance, every whisper made perfect sense. When my wife asked if I planned to downsize soon, I heard the calculation in her tone. When my son joked about modernizing the house, I sensed the hunger behind the words. When my daughter mentioned how valuable the property had become, I could practically hear the clinking of coins in her voice. The facade was crumbling, and they didn't even notice it. They thought their secrets were well hidden. They believed I was still the same man who trusted too easily. They had no idea I had uncovered their entire scheme. And then came the moment that confirmed everything. One night, long after they believed I was asleep, I heard footsteps in the hallway, whispered voices, soft, hurried discussions leaking through the crack beneath my bedroom door. I moved quietly, opening the door just enough to hear their words clearly. They were talking about me, about when and how they would make their final move, about which lawyer had agreed to take their case, about what lies they would use to paint me as unstable, irresponsible, unfit. They were willing to twist every memory, every sacrifice, every year of my life into something ugly just to justify their greed. In that moment, I saw their real faces, not the ones shaped by years of shared memories, but the ones revealed by greed, deceit, and cold ambition. And I knew that the family I had loved was gone, or maybe they had never existed at all. Maybe what I loved had only been an illusion, a story I told myself to explain away the small betrayals that had been happening for years. But now, with the truth laid bare, I felt something rise within me, a quiet, powerful determination. They thought they had cornered me. They believed I was old, soft, and predictable. They assumed I would break. But they were wrong. Because betrayal may wound, but it also awakens. It sharpens, it strengthens. I knew now exactly what I needed to do. And when I finally confronted them, not in anger, not in chaos, but with calm precision, I would not be the one caught off guard. They had built their plans in secret, but I would dismantle them in the open. And when the dust settled, they would understand that the man they had underestimated was far more dangerous than the one they had expected. The real faces of my family had been revealed, and now it was time for me to reveal my own. The one they never saw coming. The days that followed the discovery of their betrayal were some of the heaviest of my life, but they were also strangely enlightening. I had spent years believing that the world was straightforward. You worked hard, you loved your family, and in return you received loyalty, respect, and some measure of gratitude. But life had taught me a cruel but necessary lesson. Family could be the sharpest blade, and trust could become the blindfold that leads you straight into the trap. Yet even in the middle of that storm of disappointment and heartbreak, something unexpected began to grow inside me. A spark, a quiet, steady flame of clarity, and it was that flame that guided me toward the one truth my family had never expected me to realize. I was not powerless. When betrayal hits a man who has lived his whole life honestly, it shakes him to his core. It forces him to question everything, every choice, every sacrifice, every moment he once believed held meaning. But if that man chooses to stand instead of collapse, something in him shifts permanently. His innocence may die, but in its place rises a sharper, wiser version of him, one who sees not just with emotion, but with strategy. One who does not fear the shadows anymore, because he has finally learned how to walk through them with his head held high. That was the man I was becoming. In the days following the confrontation in the kitchen, I forced myself to breathe through the pain and think clearly. Emotions cloud judgment, and judgment was the one thing I could not afford to lose. I needed answers, real answers, not assumptions, not guesses, not suspicions. So I began my research quietly. I read, I studied, I asked questions without revealing why. I made calls from outside the house so no one could overhear me. I spent hours reading articles I never thought I would need in my lifetime. Property laws, inheritance rules, occupancy rights, senior protections. For the first time in years, my mind felt alive, active, and sharp. It was like rediscovering a part of myself I hadn't used in decades. The law, I realized, was not the enemy. It was a shield, one that had been waiting for me to pick it up. One evening, as I sat in the dim glow of my study lamp, surrounded by printed documents and notes, I made a decision that would change everything. I would consult a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone with experience, someone who understood the intricacies of family disputes, real estate manipulation, and deceit. Someone who could see through the lies the same way I had begun to. The first lawyer I contacted was polite but unremarkable. He listened, nodded, and spoke in vague generalities. He was careful, hesitant, not the kind of man who could stand in the fire and keep his voice steady. I thanked him and moved on. The second lawyer was sharper, but still not enough. I needed someone who understood the emotional weight of what I was dealing with, someone who had fought battles like this and had no intention of losing. Then, after days of searching, I found her. Her name was Linda Harrington, a woman in her late 50s with steel in her eyes and the calm confidence of someone who had already won 100 wars before breakfast. The moment she sat across from me, adjusting her glasses and folding her hands on the desk, I felt something shift inside me. I told her everything, slowly, carefully, but honestly. I watched her eyes narrow with focus as I described the documents, the emails, the whispered conversations. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She absorbed every word like a surgeon examining an X-ray. And when I finished, she leaned back, looked me straight in the eye, and said 7 words that changed everything for me. "David, they don't have a case at all." I will never forget the feeling that washed over me in that moment. For weeks, I had lived under the weight of betrayal, carrying the fear that I might lose everything I had worked for. And yet here was a legal expert, a professional who had seen every trick in the book, telling me that the people who tried to tear my life apart had built their entire scheme on sand. "They think they can push you out," she continued, her voice steady and oddly reassuring, "but they have no legal grounds. You paid for the house. Your name is on every major document. You've maintained it, repaired it, invested in it, lived in it. And unless you voluntarily sign anything, which you won't, they cannot force you to leave. Not legally, not ethically, not in any way." It was like breathing clean air for the first time in weeks. She explained every detail patiently, drawing diagrams, highlighting sections of legal text, underlining protections I never even knew existed. There were laws safeguarding long-term homeowners, laws protecting seniors from being wrongfully evicted, laws that required unanimous consent for property decisions if certain agreements existed, and laws that made coercion, manipulation, and fraudulent intent serious offenses. With every new fact she laid in front of me, a little more of my confidence returned. I wasn't just standing, I was rising. Linda then asked me a question that changed my mindset completely. "Do you have proof of everything you've contributed?" At first I hesitated. Proof? My life had been built on trust, not on keeping receipts. But then I realized something important. If my family was willing to forget my sacrifices, the law would not. The law required evidence. The law required facts. So I went home and began a journey I never expected to undertake. I opened old drawers filled with dusty papers. I went through folders I hadn't touched in years. I found records of mortgage payments I had made from my own salary, every installment accounted for. I found receipts from when I repaired the roof after a storm. I found invoices from when I installed a new heating system. I found old emails confirming wiring work, plumbing repairs, landscaping services. I found pictures of myself fixing things in the house over the years, photos taken casually, but now invaluable. And then I found something that brought tears to my eyes. It was a small notebook, its pages slightly yellowed with age. Inside, in my own handwriting, were notes I'd kept over the years, budget plans, scheduled repair dates, itemized expenses. I had forgotten all about this notebook, but as I flipped through the pages, I felt a deep sense of validation. Every word, every number, every date was proof of decades of responsibility and dedication. Proof of a man who had cared deeply for his home and his family. I organized everything meticulously. Documents, receipts, screenshots, printed emails, photos, voice notes were relevant, handwritten records, every piece of evidence that showed who I truly was and what I had built. It wasn't just about presenting a case. It was about preserving the truth that my family had tried to bury. As I gathered everything, something powerful began to awaken inside me, a renewed sense of identity. I was no longer the man who had been betrayed. I was the man who had survived betrayal and now stood ready to fight it. But the revelation didn't end there. One night, after organizing documents until my back ached and my eyes stung, I sat in the silence of my living room. The same living room where my family had confronted me. The same living room where they had tried to intimidate me and break my spirit. I looked around at the walls, the furniture, the memories woven into the space. And for the first time since everything began, I felt something other than pain. I felt strength. Not the loud, aggressive kind, not the strength that roars or demands attention. This was calm strength, quiet strength, the kind that lives deep inside a man who has endured storms and still stands, the kind that makes him unbreakable. I realized then that my family had miscalculated not just legally, but emotionally. They saw my kindness as weakness, my calmness as surrender, my trust as foolishness. They believed that because I had spent my life giving, I would not know how to defend myself when they decided to take. But they were wrong. Kindness is not weakness. It never has been. And a quiet man is not a helpless man. Sometimes, the quietest men are the ones who have spent a lifetime learning how to control their storms instead of unleashing them. And now that my storm had been awakened, it would not be stopped. As I stood up from the table that night, surrounded by evidence, legal documents, and a newfound sense of certainty, I felt transformed. The fear that had gripped me was gone. The confusion that had clouded my mind had lifted. The sorrow was still there. It always would be, but it no longer controlled me. What replaced it was purpose. I understood now that this battle was not about a house. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to let betrayal define me. It was about standing up not just for my rights, but for the man I had always been. The law was on my side. The truth was on my side. And for the first time since the nightmare began, I had a weapon far more powerful than fear: certainty. My family had underestimated me. And that would be the beginning of their downfall. The moment I understood the truth of what they had done to me, something hardened inside my chest, not bitterness exactly, and not just anger, but a kind of cold clarity that comes when a man finally stops living in denial and decides to take back control of his life. I knew I could not afford to lash out recklessly, because that would only feed their lies. So instead, I created a plan that was quiet, patient, and devastating in its precision. I kept living in the house exactly as before, making breakfast in the morning, stepping out for errands, trimming the lawn on weekends, all while they believed I was sitting helpless and defeated. But deep inside, I was working like a man, preparing for war, only this war would not be fought with shouting or chaos. It would be fought with evidence, truth, and timing. I began organizing every document, every receipt, every photo that proved my decades of investment into the home. But I did this carefully, making sure no one had the slightest suspicion that I was building a case. Against them, I bought secure folders and a locked metal box that I kept hidden behind the old tool drawers in my garage, a place no one ever checked because it smelled like oil and dust, and they always avoided it. And every night when everyone believed I was asleep, I quietly walked to that garage with my stack of papers, adding more and more to the folder, watching the story of my life come together piece by piece in black and white facts that no lie could erase. But evidence alone was not enough, because I knew my family had already started spreading their twisted version of the story around the neighborhood. They told people I was irresponsible, that I had refused to support them, that I was making things difficult out of stubbornness. So I made sure their lies would crumble before they even had a chance to take root. The next step in my plan was reaching out to the neighbors I had known for years, not in a dramatic or emotional way, but calmly and respectfully, the same way a man speaks when he has nothing to hide. I visited them slowly, one at a time, choosing moments when no one from my family would notice. I would stand on the front porches and quietly tell them the truth, not the entire backstory, not every painful detail, but just enough for them to understand that something unfair was happening to me, and that everything they had heard was part of a bigger scheme. The neighbors responded with surprised disappointment. and even a bit of anger because they had always known me as the man who helped shovel snow without being asked, who mowed the elderly widow's lawn when her son forgot, who fixed broken mailboxes, who lent tools without hesitation. They told me they had already felt something was off when my family started their whisper campaign, because their tone was too dramatic, too aggressive, like they were trying too hard to paint me as the villain, and people who are truly honest never try that hard to convince others. I left those conversations with a quiet sense of reassurance, knowing that the community around me had not been fooled, and that their opinions would become crucial when the truth eventually surfaced. While I played the calm father inside the house, I was in constant communication with Linda, my lawyer, and she helped structure every move like a carefully laid out strategy in a long game. She told me what documents to gather, what conversations to record in writing, and how to respond to any confrontational message. So there would be a clean paper trail showing my reasonable behavior against their hostility. Every text, every email, every attempt they made to pressure me became another brick in the strong wall I was building around myself. I even made sure to speak less around the house, avoiding any statements they could twist against me, and instead letting them expose themselves with their own impatience and cruelty. Their arrogance was one of my greatest advantages. They believed I was done, that they had backed me into a corner, and that ignorance or fear would drive me out. But what they did not know was that every threat, every insult, every careless slip of the tongue was being quietly documented in a file that would eventually land on a judge's desk and wipe their smirks right off their faces. But my plan was not just about defense. It was about turning their own tricks back onto them. They thought they could weaken me by ganging up and cornering me, so I let them believe they were succeeding, acting passive, even occasionally letting them think their words had intimidated me. I noticed how quickly their confidence grew the moment they thought I was breaking. It was like watching children playing with a fire. They did not understand. They became careless, sloppy, and more openly aggressive, making claims that contradicted their earlier stories, and that inconsistency would later destroy them in court. I never reacted, I never argued, not because I was scared, but because I needed them to walk right into the trap of their own lies, a trap of their own making. And I was patient enough to let them build it themselves. In the meantime, I strengthened my position. Ways they never anticipated. I started gathering testimonies from people who had witnessed my contributions to the house, contractors, old friends, relatives who were still loyal. I printed old bank statements showing payments made directly from my account. I even reached out to a retired city inspector who remembered me personally because I had once bought him a cup of coffee when he visited the property years ago, and he wrote a statement confirming that I had handled the renovations on my own dime. All these small pieces came together like puzzle parts, forming a picture my family did not know existed. And that picture showed the truth they had spent months trying to erase. It was almost poetic watching the same tactics they used against me turn into the weapons that would eventually dismantle their own plans. Their lies became contradictions. Their pressure became evidence. Their arrogance became my shield. And as I continued moving quietly with calm, deliberate steps, the story they thought they controlled slowly began slipping out of their hands. My revenge plan was not about hurting them. It was about exposing them. It was about letting the world see what they had done without me ever having to raise my voice. It was about defeating them with the very tools they had used to betray me: manipulation, deceit, intimidation. Except the difference was I did it legally, I did it intelligently, and I did it without losing my moral grounding. I wanted them to learn the greatest lesson a betrayer can learn, which is that when you try to take everything from a man who has lived his life honorably, the universe eventually finds a way to give that man the strength to rise above everything and stand taller than before. And so I kept moving quietly, carefully, never rushing, never revealing my hand. And the more they pushed, the more determined I became, because I knew the day was coming when all these small, silent moves would explode into one undeniable truth, the truth that I had never been the helpless one, and that their downfall would come not from my anger but from their own miscalculations. And with every passing day, I felt myself becoming stronger, steadier, more certain of what needed to be done, because this was no longer just a battle for my home. It was the lesson of a lifetime. And when the moment came for everything to unfold, they would finally understand that the quietest man in the room is often the one they should fear the most. The morning of the court hearing felt like stepping into a moment I had unknowingly been preparing for my entire life, a moment that demanded strength, courage, and a calm heart. And as I stood in the parking lot staring at the courthouse doors, I felt a mixture of nerves and determination that settled deep in my chest like a quiet fire. It was not anger anymore, and not even fear. It was something steadier, something powerful, something that felt like the first true breath I had taken in months. I adjusted my jacket, wiped my palms against my sides, and walked forward with a calmness I never expected myself to possess. And as I entered the building, passing the cold marble floors and the distant echo of heels clicking on tile, I felt a sense of seriousness settle over me, the kind that makes a man stand a little straighter and breathe a little deeper. When I finally reached the courtroom, the doors were slightly open, and I could see my family sitting inside, their faces twisted with a mix of worry, resentment, and unease. But beneath all of those emotions, there was something else too, something they never expected to feel when it came to me: fear, real fear. And that sight gave me a strange, painful, yet satisfying sense of clarity. It was the moment they realized I had not broken, and I had not backed down. Instead, I had risen higher and stronger than they ever believed possible. I walked into the room slowly, intentionally, letting each step remind me of the journey that had brought me here, every sacrifice, every night of gathering evidence, every whisper of betrayal, every layer of hurt I had peeled back and faced head-on. And as I took my seat beside my lawyer, Linda, she gave me a small nod of reassurance, the kind of nod that told me everything was in place, every detail accounted for, every legal angle covered, and that all I needed to do now was remain steady. While the truth did its work, the judge, a serious-looking man with calm eyes and a firm voice, entered shortly after, and the entire room shifted with a weight of formality that felt almost heavy. I folded my hands in front of me, breathed slowly, and watched as the clerk read out the case information. Hearing my own name spoken in a courtroom felt surreal, like watching a movie where the main character was someone else entirely. And yet I knew deeply and painfully that this was my reality, my fight, and my moment. As the hearing began, my family seemed confident at first, trying to sit up straighter, putting on expressions of innocence. But the moment my lawyer stood up with a stack of organized documents, their fake confidence crumbled little by little, because Linda did not waste a second. She began laying out the evidence with a precision that felt almost surgical. Every document, every photograph, every receipt, every bank statement was placed before the judge with clarity and firm explanation. She spoke with calm authority, her voice steady and commanding, as she described my decades of payments, repairs, maintenance, contributions, and legal responsibilities. She laid out the timeline showing how I had taken care of every major expense, how I had legally owned the house, and how there was not a single valid reason for them to claim anything against me. Then she began slowly, carefully revealing the web of lies they had spun: emails, printed screenshots, recorded messages, statements that showed their intention to manipulate, deceive, and force me out of my own home. The judge leaned forward, studying the evidence, his eyebrows tightening in disapproval with every passing minute. And I watched my family shift in their seats, growing more restless each time another document exposed yet another part of their scheme. One of them, my oldest son, tried to interrupt at one point, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But the judge raised his hand and told him to remain silent until he was asked to speak. And the look of embarrassment on my son's face was something I will remember for the rest of my life, because it was the first time I had ever seen him look genuinely small, not because of me, but because of his own actions. When the judge finally turned to them and asked direct questions, everything fell apart for them. They stumbled over their words, changed their story, contradicted each other, and delivered excuses so weak that even the people sitting in the gallery shook their heads in disbelief. They tried to claim I did not contribute financially, only for Linda to show bank transfers, contradicting their statement. They tried to argue I had agreed to leave only for Linda to present a message, proving the opposite. They tried to pretend they were concerned about my well-being, only for the judge to read their threatening emails aloud. And the sound of those words echoing across the silent courtroom felt like justice in its purest form, not loud, not vengeful, But exact and undeniable, my family sat frozen, faces pale, hands shaking. As the truth continued to unravel in front of everyone, their lies collapsed one after another like a flimsy house of cards. And when the judge asked them why they had tried to force a man out of the home he had paid for and lived in for decades, they could not answer. None of them could speak. None of them could even look at me. Their silence was louder than any confession they could have made. And in that silence, I felt a sense of release, so deep it almost brought tears to my eyes. Not sadness and not triumph, but relief. The kind of relief a man feels when the weight he has carried for months finally lifts from his shoulders. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, feeling every beat of my heart, but when my voice finally came out, it was steady, stronger than I expected. I told the judge the truth, not with anger and not with theatrics, but with the simple honesty of a man who had loved his family and been repaid with betrayal. I spoke about the years of sacrifice, the repairs, the bills, the work, the trust I had given them, and how it felt to discover they had turned against me. I told him I did not want revenge in a destructive way. I only wanted fairness, dignity, and recognition, what was rightfully mine. And as I finished speaking, I noticed something surprising. A few people in the gallery, nodding quietly with expressions of empathy. The judge studied me for a moment, then turned back to the evidence spread across his desk. He took a deep breath, leaned back in his chair, and delivered a ruling that changed everything. With a clarity that echoed through the room, he declared that my family had no legal standing, no claim to the house, no right to force me out, and no justification for their behavior. He stated firmly that I was the sole lawful owner, that I had full right to remain in my home, and that any further attempt to manipulate, intimidate, or pressure me would result in serious legal consequences for them. The words lingered in the air, heavy, sharp, final, and I watched as my family sank even lower into their seats, unable to fight, unable to argue, unable to even lift their heads, because they had been defeated not by aggression, not by shouting, not by manipulation, but by the truth. They had tried so desperately to bury. The emotional weight of the moment settled over the entire courtroom, and when the judge dismissed the case, my lawyer placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder and whispered that justice had been served. I walked out of the courtroom, slowly breathing in a way I had not breathed in months, feeling the air fill my lungs like freedom itself. And behind me, I could hear my family whispering among themselves, scrambling to understand what had just happened, but their voices felt distant, like echoes from a life that no longer belonged to me. And I realized something powerful. I did not win because I wanted revenge. I won because I stayed patient, calm, and honest while they drowned in their own deceit. And as I stepped outside into the sunlight, I knew the storm that had nearly destroyed me had finally passed, and I was walking into a new chapter where I was stronger, wiser, and no longer afraid of standing up for myself and the house that held my entire life. The moment the judge spoke the words that finally confirmed what I had feared might never happen, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a weight I had carried quietly for months, a weight made of betrayal, deception, and disbelief. I had known for weeks that I had built my case with care, that the law was on my side, that every document, every photograph, every receipt, every bank record, every tiny piece of evidence I had painstakingly gathered in the dark hours of the night would someday speak for me. But hearing it out loud in a courtroom in front of the very people who had tried to destroy me was something different. It was tangible, it was real, and it was electric. I watched my family sit there, stunned, their faces frozen, in a mixture of complete disbelief, humiliation, and fear. It was a look I had never seen before, a look that revealed the raw truth of their failure. And the moment it hit me fully, I could not help but feel a quiet, almost serene satisfaction. I had not sought revenge in the traditional sense. I had not wanted to hurt them physically or emotionally more than the natural consequence of their own actions. I had simply worked patiently, meticulously, gathering facts, exposing lies, and letting the truth do what it does best: shine brightly through deception and injustice. The ruling confirmed that I was the rightful owner of the home that I had built, maintained, and invested in over decades, that every payment, every repair, every sleepless night had counted, and that no one could legally or morally force me out. It also exposed their attempts to manipulate, deceive, and intimidate, a revelation that left them speechless and small in a way that no lecture or argument could ever replicate. I could see the tension in their bodies, the way their hands twitched, the way their shoulders slumped, and the subtle shifting of their eyes, as if they were searching for an escape that did not exist. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath around them, while I simply sat still, calm, composed, and aware that the victory I was experiencing was more than just a legal triumph. It was a reclamation of my dignity, my honor, and the peace of mind that had been stolen from me for too long. In the silence that followed the judge's ruling, I felt an extraordinary clarity, the clarity that comes when truth prevails over deception, when patience and careful planning triumph over arrogance and greed, and when a man who has been underestimated finally stands fully recognized for the person he has always been. I could almost see the thought process scrambling inside my family, the shock dawning that all their manipulation schemes and attempts to intimidate me had not only failed, but had become the evidence that ensured their own downfall. I could feel it in the air, in the way their eyes avoided mine, in the way their mouths opened slightly as if to speak, but no words would come out, because there was nothing left to say, nothing that could undo the fact that I had been right all along, that every warning sign, every instinct I had trusted about their intentions had been validated by the cold and impartial eye of the law. I stood up slowly when the judge dismissed the case and walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I had in months. The air outside felt like something new, filling my lungs with every step. I took a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and quiet triumph that is impossible to describe fully to anyone who has not walked through the fire of betrayal and emerged whole and unbroken. As I could see the whispers behind me, the shocked exchanges of words. My family could not articulate the sudden realization that their assumptions about me, their belief that I was too soft or too naive, had been entirely mistaken, and it gave me a strange, almost indescribable peace, because I had never wanted to humiliate them in a petty way. But the universe had a way of giving everyone what they deserved. And in that moment, it became perfectly clear that honesty, patience, and perseverance are more powerful than any plot, any lie, or any attempt to manipulate reality to suit selfish ends. I went back into the house later that evening and walked through every room slowly, my hands brushing over walls. I had painted, my eyes resting on the windows. I had cleaned and repaired, my fingers lingering on the furniture. I had restored piece by piece the home that had been the target of so much deceit, now felt completely and unequivocally mine, in every way, not just legally, but emotionally, spiritually, as well. I felt a sense of closure that was deeper than satisfaction, because it was built not on anger or revenge, but on justice, fairness, and the quiet knowledge that the truth had finally triumphed. I could hear the distant sounds of my family leaving the courthouse, talking in hushed tones. But their voices no longer carried power over me. The intimidation over me or control over me had vanished completely, and in its place was a profound relief, a certainty that no betrayal, no lie, no manipulation could erase the life I had built with honesty, effort, and unwavering integrity. I finally allowed myself to breathe fully, realizing that the storm of deceit that had threatened to consume me was over, and that I had not only survived it, but emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than I had ever been before. The look on their faces when they realized that they had been outmaneuvered, outwitted, and outlasted was a moment that I will never forget, a moment that confirmed everything I had worked for, every sleepless night, every painstaking effort to collect evidence, every quiet conversation with neighbors, and every long session with my lawyer had been worth it, because the truth had not just won, it had silenced the deception, it had exposed the betrayal, and restored everything I had thought might be lost. The ruling was more than a victory. It was a statement, it was a reminder to the world, and to myself, that loyalty, hard work, honesty, and patience are never wasted, even when the people closest to you try to turn them into weapons against you. And that day, I felt the deepest satisfaction of my life, because justice had been served in purest form, and the house that I had built and protected was finally and unquestionably mine. And in that clarity, I realized that true victory is not measured in anger or punishment, but in the calm, steady confidence of a man who has finally been seen for who he truly is, and who knows without a shadow of a doubt that betrayal cannot overpower truth. The days and weeks after the courtroom battle were surreal yet grounding at the same time, as if a storm had passed and left behind both debris and clarity in equal measure, forcing me to reckon with what had been lost, what had been preserved, and what I still had the power to protect. I walk through my house differently now, every corner filled not just with memories but with a sense of ownership that went far beyond legal documents. It was the feeling of a man who had fought quietly, intelligently, and patiently, and emerged whole, unbroken, and in full command of his life. I began by taking inventory of my world, not in a financial sense alone, but in terms of the people and relationships I would allow into my life, learning painfully that love alone does not guarantee loyalty or respect. I tightened my circle, choosing carefully who I would let close, who I would trust with my time, energy, and emotions. Some friendships, long neglected yet still strong, became pillars of support. Neighbors who had quietly observed my struggle reached out with words of encouragement and solidarity, and old colleagues, long forgotten in the daily grind of life, re-emerged as reminders that true connections endure through time and difficulty. The lessons learned from betrayal and deceit weighed heavily in my mind, guiding every decision and interaction, and for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to feel the peace that comes from knowing that my home, my efforts, and my integrity could not be undermined, manipulated, or stolen from me. I reflected often on the family relationships I had once taken for granted, feeling the pain of realization that some bonds could never return to what they had been. I still carried love for parts of my family, memories of laughter and shared moments, but I understood clearly that love did not obligate me to tolerate exploitation or deception. I set boundaries I had never enforced before, firm lines drawn around my personal life, my home, and my emotional energy, making it unmistakably clear that manipulation, lies, or betrayal would no longer be permitted in any form. This process was not easy. It required honest self-reflection, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and the patience to redefine relationships on my terms rather than theirs. I rediscovered hobbies and passions that I had abandoned over the years in service to others, spending hours in my garden, fixing things around the house for my own satisfaction rather than out of obligation, reading books that stirred my mind and imagination, and taking walks that reminded me the world outside my walls was vast and full of opportunities I had almost forgotten existed. I invested in friendships that nourished me, spending time with people who respected my history and celebrated my achievements without judgment or resentment. And through those connections, I slowly rebuilt a sense of normalcy and joy that had been overshadowed for far too long by conflict and betrayal. Every day I practiced self-care not as indulgence, but as a commitment to maintaining my well-being and protecting my mental and emotional state, recognizing that a man who has been betrayed must first safeguard himself before he can engage meaningfully with the world or forgive effectively. Reflection became my constant companion, and I thought often about the signs I had missed, the subtle shifts in behavior, and the early red flags that had foreshadowed the deceit, realizing that recognition is the first step toward prevention, and that vigilance is a lifelong practice. I journaled extensively, pouring out thoughts and feelings that had been suppressed, analyzing decisions I had made, mistakes I had unknowingly enabled, and patterns I would never allow again. In doing so, I gained a perspective that was both humbling and empowering, understanding that life's hardest lessons are also its most valuable, shaping us into stronger, wiser, and more resilient versions of ourselves. I also spent time considering how I could channel this experience into guidance for others, sharing insights with friends and acquaintances about the importance of valuing oneself, setting boundaries, and not allowing even those closest to manipulate or undervalue your contributions. I learned that forgiveness does not mean erasing accountability, and love does not necessitate surrendering your own peace of mind. Slowly but surely, I felt my confidence return, a quiet, steady assurance that I had endured a trial that could have crushed me but instead fortified me, teaching lessons that money, accolades, or casual experiences could never provide. Nights became calmer, sleep more restorative, and mornings carried with them a renewed sense of purpose, as if I were finally living in a life I had actively chosen rather than one dictated by the whims of others. My home became a sanctuary once more, not just a structure of brick and mortar, but a manifestation of decades of effort, care, and persistence, a place where I could think, dream, and plan without fear. I established routines that prioritized mental and physical health, combining the satisfaction of personal achievements with moments of quiet reflection that reminded me how far I had come. Each step in rebuilding my life was deliberate, intentional, and designed to prevent repetition of past mistakes, and with every boundary enforced, every decision made with care, I felt a subtle but undeniable growth in resilience. I understood now that life is a series of choices, and while we cannot always control the actions of others, we can control our response, our preparation, and our determination to protect our dignity. And so I lived each day with a renewed focus, balancing the recognition of past hurt with the excitement of new opportunities, slowly regaining joy in the simple acts of life, and cultivating a sense of fulfillment that no betrayal could undermine. The process was neither quick nor effortless. It required continuous self-examination, patience, and courage to maintain boundaries while preserving the connections that mattered. I invested in my passions fully, repairing old tools, restoring parts of the house I had long neglected, tending the garden in ways that brought pride and satisfaction, and even exploring new hobbies that expanded my horizons and rekindled creativity and curiosity I had forgotten I possessed. Social interactions became selective and meaningful rather than casual and obligatory, ensuring that every person I allowed into my space contributed positively rather than draining my energy or challenging my well-being. And though memories of the betrayal lingered like a shadow at the edge of consciousness, they no longer controlled my reactions or dictated my feelings. Instead, they served as constant reminders of lessons learned and the vigilance required to prevent history from repeating itself. I found peace in knowing that I could love parts of my family without being harmed by them, that I could engage in relationships without giving up my power, and that my life, my home, and my spirit were mine to protect and nurture. I also began volunteering in small ways, offering guidance to neighbors and friends who faced challenges in standing up for themselves, sharing what I had learned about resilience, self-respect, and the importance of recognizing betrayal early before it could take root. Over time, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I was calmer under pressure, more deliberate in decision-making, and far more confident in asserting my needs without guilt or hesitation. I found joy in solitude without feeling lonely and satisfaction in accomplishments big and small, without seeking validation from those who had previously undermined me. Each day I reinforced the idea that loyalty must be respected, honesty must be defended, and self-worth must never be compromised for the comfort or approval of others. I reflected on how betrayal had altered the course of my life, but also how it had strengthened me in ways I never would have discovered otherwise. I realized that the pain had been a crucible, refining my judgment, fortifying my resolve, and teaching me to navigate life with sharper perception and unshakable integrity. Slowly but undeniably, life regained balance, stability, and meaning, and I embraced the profound satisfaction that comes from protecting oneself while still living with kindness, curiosity, and the ability to love responsibly. In the end, rebuilding my life was not just about reclaiming my home or proving a point to those who had tried to betray me. It was about reclaiming myself, my peace, and my power, understanding that boundaries are not walls meant to isolate, but shields meant to preserve what is valuable, and learning that true resilience comes not from avoiding pain, but from facing it with clarity, patience, and unwavering self-respect. And through that painstaking yet liberating process, I became a man who was stronger, wiser, and more fully alive than I had ever been before, ready to embrace each day with renewed purpose. Secure in the knowledge that betrayal may wound, but it cannot define, limit, or destroy the man who has learned to stand firm and guard what truly matters. When I look back on everything that happened, the betrayals, the lies, the twisted attempts to push me out of my own home, and the long battle that followed, I realize now more than ever that the greatest lesson I gained was about the true meaning of loyalty and the power of respecting myself, even when others refuse to respect me, because loyalty is not defined by blood alone, and family does not always mean protection. Sometimes it means facing the hardest hurt in this world, because the people you trusted most can forget everything you did for them, the sacrifices, the nights you stayed up worrying, the choices you made to give them better lives, and still act as if you owe them more and more without end. And that truth hit me harder than any courtroom pressure or confrontation inside my house, because it forced me to see my life clearly for the first time, showing me that love without boundaries becomes a tool for others to use against you, and self-respect becomes the shield you never realized you needed until it is almost too late. And I want people listening to understand that standing up for yourself is not arrogance, nor cruelty, nor revenge-driven spite. It is survival, it is dignity. It is the moment you decide that you will not shrink yourself just to keep the peace in a family that refuses to value you, and will not treat you fairly unless you force them to face consequences. And it took me years to understand that sometimes doing the right thing for yourself means stepping into uncomfortable territory, facing people you care about who suddenly become strangers, trying to strip you of everything you built piece by piece. And even though those moments feel like the darkest ones in your life, they are the moments that sharpen your spirit and reveal your strength. And I learned that patience matters more than anger, because anger can make you reckless, while patience lets you move methodically, gathering truth, gathering control, gathering the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are not wrong, and you are not helpless, and the truth will carry you if you protect it carefully and refuse to let fear guide your actions. And I also learned that planning is not just for business or work, it is the backbone of personal survival. Because when people betray you secretly, they assume you will react emotionally and without thought. And that is exactly how they try to win. But when you stay calm, steady, and focused, they start to panic, because they cannot predict the man who refuses to be provoked, and instead thinks clearly before every move. And that power is something I had never fully recognized in myself until everything began to crumble, and I had to choose whether to be crushed by betrayal or shaped by it. And I chose the second one, because I refused to allow their lies to define me or control the direction of my life. And I stood firm and fought and documented and learned and prepared. And in the end, their entire plan collapsed under the weight of their own dishonesty. And that moment taught me that justice can be slow and heavy, but it arrives eventually. And when it does, it washes away the dirt people try to throw on your name, leaving you standing taller than before, not just because you won, but because you survived with integrity and tact. And I want anyone listening to my story to understand that protecting your home, your rights, and your dignity is not selfish. It is necessary, because if you do not value yourself, no one else will. And if you allow others to walk over you once, they will return again and again, until there is nothing left of you but exhaustion and regret. And that is no way to live. So set boundaries early and clearly and firmly, even with the people you love the most, and never feel guilty for demanding respect when you have given it freely your whole life. And do not ignore warning signs. Do not excuse behavior that hurts you, and do not let anyone convince you that your feelings are not valid, because the moment you start to doubt yourself is the moment manipulators win. And I learned this at an age when most people believe life has already taught them everything. But life taught me that you are never too old to learn strength, and never too experienced to gain new wisdom, and never too broken to rebuild yourself again and again, stronger each time. And now, when I look at my home, the same walls that once felt cold after their betrayal feel warm again, because they remind me of resilience. They remind me that peace does not come from blind loyalty, but from balanced relationships where respect is exchanged, not demanded, and where love is a choice, not an obligation twisted by greed or entitlement. And I want people to know that no matter how painful betrayal feels, it is not the end of your story, it is the beginning of a new chapter one, where you choose how to be treated, choose how to live, and choose how to protect yourself. And once you learn that lesson deeply, truly, you will never again allow anyone, even family, to push you into a corner where you feel powerless or unworthy. And you will stand with your head high knowing that self-respect is the most powerful form of love, because it teaches others exactly how you expect to be treated, and it teaches you that you deserve every ounce of peace, stability, and fairness you fought so hard to reclaim. And with that truth settled inside me, I finally understood that the day my family tried to evict me was not the day I lost, it was the day I woke up, became wiser, and discovered a strength inside me that will carry me for the rest of my life. Because betrayal does not define you, your response to it does, your courage does, your dignity does, and that is the ultimate lesson. I walked away with a lesson worth every battle, every tear, and every moment of silence that followed after finally standing up for myself.